A middle-aged man sits slumped in a stuffy interrogation room, his face streaked with tears. He's been in here for over 17 hours, no food, no rest, just relentless questioning. Bit by bit, the police have chipped away at his sanity and then told him an obscene lie, one that'll go down in the annals of American law enforcement's Hall of Shame. They've convinced this guy that he killed his own father. They've even convinced his dog. This is just one of the frankly unbelievable stories you'll hear about on today's episode of The Infographic Show, Tricks Cops Use Against Prisoners. Number 7. The detective stubs out what must be his 10th cigarette in an hour into an overflowing ashtray. With his red face screwed up with fury, he slams his fist down, causing cigarette butts to go flying all over the table. He points to a long paper printout on a metal table, its face revealing a series of jagged black and red lines. "The machine doesn't lie, buddy," says the other detective, the one who's been much friendlier. "Those spikes mean you're not telling us the truth." The suspect is sitting opposite, and later 3 other men, all U.S. Navy, will admit to brutally killing a woman and will spend around a decade in prison. And all of them were completely innocent. The 4 men had been held at the police station, accused of murder. Their alleged victim was 18-year-old Michelle Moore Bosco. She had been found strangled and stabbed in the small apartment that she shared with her husband in Norfolk, Virginia, a city known for being home to the largest naval base in the world. Michelle's husband was a sailor stationed nearby, so were plenty of others. One of them was a young man named Daniel Williams, who was said to have been obsessed with Michelle. Once the cops heard that, they zeroed in on him. After over 9 hours of intense questioning, Williams confessed, stating that he had beat her to death with a shoe. He denied choking or stabbing her, which didn't corroborate with the crime scene. But after some coaching, he changed his statement to include a knife. Police later arrested another man, Joe Dick, and after a traumatizing interrogation, he also confessed. In fact, he implicated his colleague, Eric Wilson. Wilson then said that 6 men were involved, although he didn't know all their names. He gave a description of their faces, which led to detectives arresting a 4th man, Derek Tice. Like the others, he wasn't offered a lawyer. He broke when threatened with the death penalty. The men's confessions were the result of intensive, unethical coaching. Their DNA wasn't found at the scene, and 2 of the men weren't even in Norfolk at the time that Michelle was murdered. Nonetheless, it seems that the detectives weren't interested in the finer details. This shows that relentless interrogations can break just about anyone, even 4 mentally stable young men with military training. Detectives exhausted them. They lied about what each man had said about the others. But the one thing that pushed them over the edge was the fake polygraph. The tests were administered, but the cops lied about the results. Once the men were convinced the machine never lies, they were persuaded to confess to escape the death penalty. In 1999, a woman handed the police a letter written by Omar Ballard, a convict serving 41 years. In the letter, he confessed to killing Michelle, and he said that he'd done it alone. His DNA matched the DNA found at the crime scene. Still, despite the evidence and Ballard's letter confession to the police, for many years the state refused to reopen the case. The 4 men served between 8 and 11 years, and it wasn't until 2017 that they were granted unconditional pardons. A Supreme Court recognized that falsified polygraph results can coerce a suspect into making a confession. The men sued the state for $4.9 million. This wasn't the first time, and it likely won't be the last, that detectives lied about a polygraph to secure a confession. In this next story, we'll see how police have taken the polygraph lie to another level. Number 6. In 2005, a deadly shooting took place in a Jack in the Box parking lot in Sacramento, California. It didn't take long for the police to arrest a young man named Darius Antoine Mays. Confident that he could prove his innocence, Mays demanded a polygraph test. And that was a bad idea. A very bad idea. Pretty soon, the detectives connected patches to his body to check minute changes in his pulse, blood pressure, breathing, and sweat. These patches led to wires that fed into the machine that scratched its results onto the face of a white paper. One of the detectives tore the paper off and told May the bad news. He said, quote, "Perhaps the defendant failed because he was present during the crime and felt some guilt about that." The paper they showed him proved that he lied, and soon Mays was on video saying, "Actually, yeah, I was kinda there." A jury later convicted him of first-degree murder. But that test, it was a big lie. On the day of the interrogation, they didn't even have a polygraph expert at the station. They hooked Mays up to the machine and turned it on, but it wasn't actually working. The results they showed him were just a ruse to persuade him to start talking, which is usually the main function of polygraphs, rather than being evidence presented at trials. He eventually appealed his sentence, saying that he'd been entrapped and the jury should never have heard his confession. He only said those things because the police were essentially scamming him. The judge said sure, there had been subterfuge, but it was fair game subterfuge that didn't qualify as coercive. The official verdict read, "Police trickery that occurs in the process of a criminal interrogation does not by itself render a confession involuntary and violate the state or federal due process clause." As you'll see later, the US is a special case in this regard. In other countries, it would be conceived as unethical, and it would likely destroy the case. As for Mays, he is now serving the rest of his life behind bars without the possibility of parole. Number 5. In 1982, police in the Magnolia neighborhood of Seattle were called to the back of a TV store where they found the body of a 13-year-old, Kristen Sumstad, stuffed into a box. There were no immediate suspects, but the police never gave up the hope of finding her killer. Almost 20 years later, in 2003, they were still looking for the perpetrator. They had a suspect, a man named John Athan. Athan was living a seemingly normal life as the owner of a home remodeling company. He was 14 at the time of the murder and a good friend of Kristen's older sister. The problem was, police in 2003 didn't have much evidence. That meant that they couldn't get a warrant to force him to give up some of his DNA, and asking someone for DNA can ruin a case. So they got tricky. They sent him a letter from a fake law firm. The contents told him that he could be part of a class action lawsuit over parking tickets and stood to get some money out of it. Excited about an unexpected windfall, Athan licked the envelope and sent it back. And that was it. Busted. His DNA matched the DNA found on Kristen Sumstad, and along with the other evidence, it was enough to send him to prison. But the case later went to the Supreme Court because Athan's lawyers argued that this police subterfuge was a breach of their client's privacy rights. Nonetheless, the court ruled that it was no different from collecting DNA from a discarded cigarette or from the rim of a beer glass. The judge said, police officers are allowed to use some deception, including ruses, for the purpose of investigating criminal activity. Athan, who was not considered a violent man, spent 7 years in prison. Number 4. When police interrogate suspects, they usually try to build rapport with the suspect. You'll see as we go on that this isn't always the case. Sometimes they break you, and we mean break. This is how they do it. A suspect has been dragged into a small, dingy room to talk about the murder of their wife. The room is bare without any clocks, so they won't have a sense of time. It's uncomfortable, and sometimes the suspect is sat in the corner of the room. All of this is to create psychological unease, because stress might increase compliance. The questions deliberately start easy. Most will be neutral, but then one of them will be loaded. And that's about the time the suspect might start getting fidgety, touching their nose or fiddling with their hair. These can be signs of nervousness, but of course they could also be nervous and innocent. Still, if police see signs of anxiety, they will usually step things up. The main detective walks out of the room and leaves the suspect to stew. He then walks back in with a file in his hand and he says something like, "Look, we know you were there on the night of the crime. We have solid evidence." This is a lie. It's all part of the ruse. Once the suspect's anxiety levels are peaking, the detective tells them that he understands. After all, boys will be boys, nagging wives and so on. That might sound sexist, but what the cops are actually doing here is playing down the moral consequences so the accused won't feel as bad if they confess. The police try to minimize evil acts by letting the suspect know the officers are kind of on their side. They might give 2 options for what happened, one less monstrous than the other, so the suspect can confess and not feel like such a hideous wife-killing beast. If that doesn't work, they might then start screaming, and maybe after 5 hours of denials, once the suspect is emotionally exhausted, the aggressive cop might be replaced with a friendly cop. The good cop, bad cop routine. If the good cop is believable and he feels like a friend who understands why talky wives gotta go, well, the suspect might start spilling their guts. The problem with this approach is after countless hours of being tormented, people might make a false confession just to make it stop. And this is what happened to Daryl Parker, who in 1955 walked into his Nebraska home for his lunch break to find his wife on the floor, beaten and strangled. One of the cops who later interviewed him was John Reed, whose so-called Reed technique of interrogation we just partly outlined. After a fairly quiet preliminary interview, Reed called Mr. Parker into the station again, and for the next 12 hours he sent Parker's mind hurtling around a psychological roller coaster. Reed emotionally manipulated a man who was already distraught over losing the woman he dearly loved. Parker confessed. The Reed technique was actually too good, but the American police used it as a standard for many years to come. Parker recanted his confession almost immediately, but it didn't make any difference. He wasn't released from prison until 1970, and even though another man confessed to the murder, he was exonerated in 2011 when he was in his 80s. He told the press, "At least now I can die in peace." Okay, let's now discuss a case when emotional manipulation was replaced with threats and brutality. This is the old school method, still popular today in countries where there is a fine line between the goodies and the baddies. Number 3. In 1987, the body of 20-year-old Leonard Ruffin was found in a Detroit alley. Police questioned a 17-year-old named Paul Young, who told them that he couldn't have committed the murder because he was in a hotel with two friends, 19-year-old Danny Burton and 18-year-old David Owens. Police said that these three were part of a crack cocaine dealing outfit, and after an altercation, Owens had shot Ruffin and the others had helped him dump the body. This was just an average day in Detroit, but detectives weren't exactly ethical once they had those guys in custody. Burton later said that they handcuffed him to a chair and a table, and when he gave an answer that didn't fit their theory, Sergeant Ronald Sanders kicked him in the groin. When that didn't work, Sanders unholstered his gun and stuck the end in Burton's mouth. Burton asked for a lawyer and a phone call, and he said that he wished to remain silent, which by law should have been granted, but it wasn't. Instead, Sanders punched and slapped Burton, knocking him to the floor. Sanders subsequently indulged in what we might call the hotshot technique of interrogation. That's when the cops tell a suspect they can easily give him or her a deadly shot of heroin. It's a threat to their life. In Burton's case, Sanders told them that he'd say that he went to grab his gun, and in the melee the gun went off. This can be a very effective technique, especially back then, because no one trusted the cops, especially black guys. Sure, Sanders was never going to do it, but what mattered was Burton believed it. Burton later testified, "Afraid and in pain from the assault, I responded by telling Detective Sergeant Sanders that I wanted to take a polygraph test to show that I was not lying about I was not there." In the end, he confessed. He later wrote, "Out of fear and feeling totally helpless, I eventually gave an unwilling statement." In 1987, the jury convicted Young and Burton of first-degree murder, and both men were sentenced to life in prison without parole. A year later, Owens, who had been on the run, got 25 years. One of the witnesses who helped send them to prison later said Sanders had paid her $40 to $60 on about 10 occasions so she would lie. He told her that he'd make sure her children were taken away from her if she didn't testify. Owens was released in 2014, but both Burton and Young stayed in prison until 2019, despite ample evidence that showed that they were innocent men. Burton, then in his 60s, received $1.6 million in compensation, and Young filed a claim for the same amount in 2022. In this next case, the emotional brutality is quite frankly beyond belief. Number 2. In 2018, Tom Perez, a resident of Fontana, California, called the local police non-emergency number. His elderly father, 71-year-old Papa Tom, had gone missing. Perez got a call later asking him to come to the local police station to help with inquiries. But it didn't go quite as he expected. They eventually told Perez they knew it was him who was behind his father going missing. They had told him he'd killed him. Before Perez could react, another detective entered the room. He told Perez that they'd found his father's body. He was currently lying on a gurney in the morgue. Perez was distraught, but he couldn't grieve. He had to defend himself. The subsequent interrogation lasted for 17 hours, during which time Perez continually broke down in tears, often clutching a tissue to his tear-filled eyes. They denied him access to drugs that he was taking for high blood pressure, depression, stress, and asthma, although police later said that this wasn't true. The detectives told him they'd found some blood in his father's home, which was true, but only a little bit. There was broken furniture everywhere. Again, true, but he was in the process of moving. They said they had video evidence of him dumping clothing with blood on it, and they knew that he'd buried the body. Both of those were blatant lies. The detectives then used the tried and tested method of getting a member of the public to convince the suspect to confess. They enlisted one of Perez's best friends, who went to the interrogation room and told Perez that for the good of his family he should come clean. The police had already convinced the friend that Perez was guilty. If those cops couldn't sink any lower, they then brought Perez's pet dog Margot into the room, hoping that some love and affection might convince him to do the right thing. This wasn't a satirical comedy, it was real. Perez broke down in tears again. The detective then sunk to new depths of shamelessness by telling Perez they would have to put poor Margot down. Her mind had been devastated by trauma and she didn't stand a chance without her dad. After 17 hours of this torture, thinking that he had lost his father and his pet dog that he adored, Perez was wrapped in a blanket looking like he just survived a massacre. Hopelessly, he finally confessed. The detective asked him how he did it, to which the distraught Perez said that he stabbed him. And when he asked where he stabbed him, Perez mumbled, it might have been the belly? It sounded like a question, not a statement. But for more proof, interrogation can break your brain. In a kind of out-of-body state, Perez sniveled and pleaded for forgiveness. They had actually convinced him. But the father wasn't dead. The cops had lied. They'd never known where the father was, And then after Perez came clean, they learned that the father had been found at the LAX airport about to get on a flight to go visit his sister. However, they left Perez in the interrogation room. It was only 5 days later at a psychiatric hospital when Perez found out he still had a father. After 5 days of pure hell, he and his dad were reunited. He later settled a $900,000 lawsuit against the city of Fontana, but as of 2024, he hadn't received an apology. As for the detectives, one of them won the Employee of the Year shortly after in 2019. Number 1. In 2010 and 2011, it was discovered that a large number of undercover British cops had gotten into relationships with female activists. Rather than bring the women in to question them, the undercover cops made the women believe that they loved them so they could relay information back to HQ. Sure, this might have been okay in terms of ethics had it been a one-night stand or even a brief fling, but these lying policemen dated the women for years. In some cases, the officers married the women and had children with them. The women were living a lie with a husband who had a fake name and a fake job. And worse, after years passed, the operation would end and the husband would just disappear, leaving the woman and her kids heartbroken. In one case, Officer Mark Kennedy had his cover blown by one of his lovers and friends after 8 years. She had later said in an interview, there was always something mysterious about him. A court later said that he had grossly debased, degraded, and humiliated her, although he claimed that they, quote, did nothing to prevent me falling in love, which he said gave him post-traumatic stress syndrome. In total, 12 women sued the police, saying that they'd been the victim of some serious psychological torture. A subsequent inquiry said this kind of police work was beyond comprehension, calling it cruel and manipulative, not to mention the many millions that it cost for these operations over the many years they ran. So if you think cops are tricky in the USA, at least they're not professional heartbreakers, or are they? Are these tactics clever police work or crossing the line? Which interrogation technique surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments. Now you need to go watch Cop Goes Undercover, Then Becomes a Drug-Addicted Killer, or have a look at Undercover Agent Who Spent 24 Months in a Mexican Cartel.